our ideas and the domestic violence field affects some of our thinking. And then, like Dr. V and others have said, like I'm over at License to Freedom. I'm the head of family therapy services there, and we got this like incredible privilege and benefit to take the model of practice that came out of my research project and kind of put it into a grant that we are now running a program through. So my hope is to share a little bit about the research and the program. I get hung up on certain ideas and conversations, so like feel free to push me along or ask questions. I'm also very dialogic and open to any questions you might have. So I know you can't maybe share it given the webinar format, but you can put it in the chat and I have it open and tracking. Um, yeah, and as you all listen to some of the ideas I am holding, I hope that you can kind of find points of convergence and divergence because again, the domestic violence field is really diverse, and not just in terms of like providers, but in terms of ideas. And there's a lot of different stakeholders and kind of positions that people hold on what healing is, what safety is, what is a path and route to those things. And I don't know that any one person or thing holds all the answers. So I hope that you hold my ideas um, gently. I'm always interested in your thoughts and feedback, and also the places where you find yourself connecting with me and diverging with me are really important for you to consider. Well, what is important to you? What do you stand for? Can be kind of a useful reflexive practice. So again, my name is Navid Zamani. Today I want to talk. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction, talk about the context and the problem framing that brought me to this research project, what I did discover in the research, and then I'll talk about the down and forward approach, which is the model of practice that I developed through the research. So really quickly, was born and raised here in Southern California. My family is Iranian. Both my parents are immigrants from Iran. Um, and I have been honored to be in the domestic violence field since about 2010. So for some of you, it's a long time. For others of you, it's like nothing at all. But like Vanessa, Dr. V was saying, it has, yeah, it's been a really good but hard and long 15 years. So I'm a marriage family therapist. So my orientation to the work and ideas come from a family therapy context. Like I mentioned, I am involved in like academic contexts, particularly through scholarship and research. Um, and my history in domestic violence work has taken me across a lot of different contexts. I have been at License to Freedom since about 2010. I spent some time on the domestic violence response team and a shelter over at South Bay Community Services. Um, I was involved with providing term groups for CWS, both on the survivor side. I run 52-week DVIP programs on the offender side. And now at License to Freedom, I kind of oversee and support the family therapy program and provides clinical supervision for about 8 to 9 therapists. Yeah, and that is my son Reza. That's actually an old photo on the top left. He is now a year and a half, and he's just very fun. And then that's my wife Katie, my daughter Layla, and my dog Mobley there in the middle. And I'm here in North Park, so I love San Diego. You'll see pictures of my garden throughout this presentation at some points. You'll see some surfing videos that I just threw in there. So, uh, I think part of the domestic violence work and the ability to do it requires us to kind of have a bunch of context where we live outside of the work. So, as I go through, you'll kind of see some ideas that I hold dear right through. Um, I don't know that as Mark Twain said, a self-made man is like a self-laid egg. So all the ideas that I hold and all the ways that I've come to understand my positions is through the um, mentorship, writing, reading, support, thinking of others that have been really important to me. So like my bio mentioned, I kind of come from a philosophical position of a post-structural decolonial feminism. And those are a really big context, but for the context of this conversation, the post-structural piece uh, is a philosophical position that invites us to consider experience and events by context. So as we're talking about power, as we're talking about ethics, as we're talking about relationships, I'm really invested in context and suspicious of generalities. Decolonial framework, and in this context, and from some of my refugee work, uh, makes visible that the relational dynamics and the psychoeducational materials that we tend to use in the field privilege American relationships, like they privilege Western, US specifically, um, ways of thinking, approaches to life, and relationships. Again, I'm not, and as I go through this, um, I want to be careful about folks kind of interpreting anything I'm saying as comments on good or bad or right or wrong, um, and rather just like maybe an add-on or a consideration from the margins of the work that could be useful. So as I kind of talk about a decolonial framework, I'm not saying that like the US ideas are bad or should not be used, but acknowledging the power that they hold as refugee families come into contact with the services. And of course, feminism, honoring that the reason that anyone even knows what domestic violence is in the United States is from the writing and blood and sweat of feminist activists in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I ride the legacy of a lot of very cool and smart women and activists. Linguistic justice, honoring especially here in San Diego, we have a lot of multilingual, bilingual families. And so what does it mean when our work goes across linguistic contexts? Revolutionary love, I think it's interesting that in the domestic violence field, we don't talk about love very much. We talk a lot about violence. We talk a lot about safety, important stuff, accountability. But like love is a really critical part of these experiences, and is a little bit uncomfortable to like look at and talk about when we're talking about violence and especially severe harm and homicides at times. Um, and a revolutionary love for me is an interest in how do I hold people accountable while at the same time simultaneously holding compassion for their circumstances and context. And again, I'm making a distinction between context and excuse. And then I'll talk about the ethics of care a little bit later as well. So really quickly, License to Freedom. We are a domestic violence agency that supports Middle Eastern refugees. Our team is comprised of a lot of different linguistic and cultural contexts, and our staff are refugees, immigrants, children of immigrants like myself, and settlers. And so I'm very proud that everyone on our team speaks a different language and is able to access a particular corridor of the communities that we serve. And we offer a wide breadth of services. I'm part of the family therapy team, and I have that start there, Vehma, because I'm going to talk about that here today. We have crisis intervention and legal services. We have the United We Sew program, which supports women in developing, learning how to sew and developing and creating traditional garments that they then sell biannual bazaars. So we're hoping that at our East County um, domestic violence rally on October 24th. I hope you join us. We start at the El Cajon PD and go to Prescott Park. We're hoping to have a bazaar of some of the women kind of selling their stuff there. So come check us out over there on October 24th. We have housing navigators, early child development programs. We have ESL classes and other Afghan community programs. We have a fatherhood engagement program, the 52-week domestic violence intervention program that I run, as well as a youth mentorship program. And they play soccer and do some fun stuff together. So that's our programs. And always, if you have any questions or anything, you can reach out to me. I'll drop my email in the chat later. So let's talk about what we're here to talk about. So I came into this research question after confronting a lot of dilemmas in my work. And I wonder, and in some ways, I hold the assumption, if you feel comfortable, you can share in the chat, that some of you may have encountered the same kind of questions and concerns. One I'll start with is I remember being at the shelter and I just come fresh out of my DV training stuff. I was like fresh out of school, really excited, full of an interest, a curiosity, interest. And I was kind of like engaging with the power control wheel and the relationship cycles dynamics, some of that Duluth model, psychoeducational materials with a client who had just entered. And at the time at the DV shelter, we had funding for families, so there had to be children. So I'm talking with the mom. Children were not, they were not in the room with us at that time, and we were kind of going through her intake. And part of the intake process required a psychoeducational piece where I talk about the power control wheel and relationship cycles and stuff like that. And I remember going through the DV, the power control wheel and the cycle, and the way that it was framed kind of centered, generally speaking, a power and control hungry man whose interest was in victimizing and perpetrating dynamics of power and control on a uh, cisgendered female recipient of that violence. And so I'm going through this cycle, and she kind of pauses and kind of nervously at one point turns to me and says, like, this isn't really how I experience it. I would kind of hit him a lot as well. I remember at the time being like, wait, what? I don't even know what to do with that. What are you talking about? How can this exist? This wasn't part of my training or my history. And this could threaten your stay at the shelter. Um, and that was like one of my first encounters with a story that didn't fit cleanly into the ideas I was taught. So, and just I think because it's important, this was also with a Spanish-speaking immigrant. Yeah. And I'll share why I'm kind of naming the that piece in a little bit. So then I find myself at License to Freedom working prominently with Middle Eastern refugees and immigrants, and kind of start to encounter the ways that the system is set up to deal with families. And so one of the ways that I've come to understand the setup of our field, I hope these are taken and understood as loving critiques and not stabs, um, is we're kind of like a broken bridge where we have a lot of services, beautiful services, honestly, at the bottom of the bridge as families drive off and land. And there's not a lot of preventative efforts at times at the top of the bridge to kind of, or signage that says like, there's a bridge here, it's not connected, it's not working, go around. Much of the funding and money and efforts were to pick up the pieces after some event had happened. So I'm going to share a story about one of these families that I worked with. And I've obfuscated details to protect everyone involved, but this is a real story. So I'm I'm running a 52-week group, and I encounter a Syrian Middle Eastern man. And anyone that runs 52 weeks groups, I think you might be able to relate to this, that like there's certain people that come through the group that really could benefit from our services and from the group, and they kind of fit the mold of the perpetrator. And then sometimes, and if you disagree, let me know, put in chat. There's also people that come through that sometimes I believe that the system doesn't really know what to do with. So it's kind of like we just kind of put them in the existing treatment context. So the male client, the father goes into the 52-week group, mother goes into victim services. And so I'm working with this Assyrian family. Mom is on the survivor side working with another therapist. I'm working with dad. And I come to learn the story that really resonates with a lot of other of the clients and also has been I've heard in other forms through my time in the field. So picture this. You're an Arabic speaking family who's just landed in the United States. We have very little social safety nets here in the United States, especially for refugees and immigrants. So you kind of land in, you don't have a lot of language access. The bureaucratic and administrative might of the United States is foreign and unclear how to like engage with different services and schools and all the forms necessary to like get the things that you need. You have now emerging linguistic barriers with your children. Your children are also becoming culturally different as they enroll in school and start to take on American cultural um, features. And you're placed into a rather small apartment. Yeah, in let's say this is an Oklahoma. And these apartments often have like pretty thin walls. And so now dad is under a lot of financial stress. Well, the whole family is, but dad, in the kind of the patriarchal structure of the family, is expected to be the one that gets money. And now the family, and particular mom, is like looking at the dad and saying, like, why aren't you pulling your weight? What is happening? He's turning back to her saying, like, I'm trying to get a job. I can't. My English is not very good. And as you can imagine, the tension and the pressures of this scenario continue to mount more and more. Um, they start arguing in Arabic. And for American ears, if it's fair to say, Arabic is one of those languages. I know it's kind of related to German. I speak Farsi. My family's Iranian, so I can relate to this piece myself. That Arabic in our ears sounds aggressive, even when they're not saying aggressive things. Kind of like I think the corollary is like German, where it sounds like it's aggressive just to the ways that the tone of our ears are set up for English. Um, and so then the neighbors call the police and they say, hey, as any good neighbor should do, right? They hear what they think is a domestic dispute. They interpret it as like a really scary argument. The police show up, and now you have Al Cajon PD come to the door and do a little check. And now, mind you, the family is like not back home. The police are not safe and they're scary. Um, and now they have the police showing up their door, and for a reason they're not entirely clear of. And something that is important to mention here to like kind of make visible a little bit of the political domain is that a large proportion, from my experience and what I've witnessed, of law enforcement sometimes have military history. And a lot of these guys, especially in Elko PD, have a history in the Iraq War. They're Iraq War vets. So now you have former military members who were part of the invading force of these countries, policing those same communities that were displaced due to that war and invasion. And so some of those like perspectives and lens are applied in making this some of the distinction and decisions around what happened there. So then charges are filed. We go through the criminal control model, where then the DA picks up the case, puts on charges, felony charges, and the public defender and now the DA are kind of going back and forth to figure out a plea deal, yeah, which is the majority percentage of cases are kind of run through a plea deal process. And the public defender, God bless them, they do important, difficult work, rightfully turns to the client and says, look, you are getting charged with 5 felony counts or 4 felony counts. And he's like, what are the felony and why am I getting these charges? And they were for a variety of things. One of them was vandalism. One of them was endangerment to the children because they were in the back room when the police arrived. I think domestic battery. And then this one was an interesting one. The lawyers in the room are not going to like this because I can't remember the exact language, but it's a criminal intent to murder, like a threat to kill someone effectively. And the client's really confused by all of them, but particularly this one, and kind of in exploring further what it meant, finds out that when the fight was translated into English, certain things didn't land into English in ways that make sense. So this is the example I'll use, and forgive my language here. I'm going to use some harsh English language here, so hide your children's ears. Um, if in the United States we're getting into a big fight with someone and we're really upset, and we want to make them upset, and we say like F you, right? Like the F word, F you. If we were to directly translate that, like let's say let's say you're in Iraq, you're in court, and they're going through your transcripts and they say F you and they translate it directly into Arabic, it would kind of be like sex you. And it wouldn't really make a lot of sense because when we're using the F word, we're using the emotional qualities of it, not necessarily like the literal connotation of the word, the F word. So in Arabic, people will be like, why are you even saying this statement, if that makes sense? So now, bringing it back to our context, this client makes a statement saying, and I'll use Farsi because that's what I speak. For example, a statement like "mag to shoshet," which in Farsi means death to your lungs, but doesn't actually mean death to your lungs. It's a emotive statement. And this phrase, the Arabic version of a phrase like this, got understood as a terroristic threat to kill his wife. And so this is a linguistic justice issue, yeah, because now we're taking language directly across into English and it carries a hefty penalty, yeah. So then this family kind of finds themselves confronted with the necessity of restraining orders. The, the dad says, "Well, this is America. I thought there's justice here. I'm not going to plead guilty." And the public defender, honestly, rightfully, says to the client, "Look, if you plead not guilty and go through this into a criminal trial, you're going to be in front of a white jury that's going to see a bearded Middle Eastern Muslim guy saying that he didn't beat his wife, and you're going to lose." And the public defender is right. So the client takes the plea deal, ends up in my 52-week group, and now he's a Syrian man. I'm going to let's say an Iraqi man now lands in my group, and now he's working with an Iranian. And so these are now interesting contexts to consider political territories because in the US, often we're considered all as Middle Eastern, but when you kind of go into our kind of political territory, there's a lot of history and baggage that all of us carry with us. And one of those things is the Iran-Iraq War, where millions of people died on both sides of that war. And there's tension. And so then this guy's now sitting with an Iranian guy being told, learn about accountability, safety, and peace. And he's looking at me as your uncles probably attacked my family back home. And so that puts on an ethical responsibility for me on how I am managing those conversations. And that's for a whole different thing, but how I manage those conversations is really important because it does start to model and reflect practices of accountability and repair. But that's for a whole different presentation. So um, now I'm working with dad. Mom and her kids are in the survivors work. There's a restraining order. Dad is now out of the house, living in his car. Is unclear on why he can't be back with his family. Mom is unclear on why he can't be back with his family. But the threat of child services, which are involved in the picture, and the criminal court system and the justice system is the fear of it is very powerful and present. And so it's having some effects. So this family is now in a place where they're like unclear on how to proceed and how to get any services together or like start to heal as a family. They're kind of frozen in time, effectively for a year as the 52-week group and the core processes go forward, before they're able to kind of, yeah, move forward in their lives. So this is just one of many stories that I've encountered, and these start to create a lot of questions for me, like why is it that no one can work with families? And of course, there's the obvious stuff on the surface, right? That rightfully there's a history where, well, if we're privileging safety, we can't just immediately bring people back together. People do, domestic violence field is high stakes. People do die. Homicides are unfortunately not unusual. Um, and so there's a lot of really good reason to not get people together and very good reasons why there are systems in place like restraining orders to protect people and create some sort of separation. So I'm not disputing that. But all that to say is that our domestic violence field is kind of centered around the crime control model and the Duluth model, both of which are systems that came out in the 80s. So the crime control model, prior to the Reagan administration, there was about 5,000 grassroots feminist organizations that were helping women and other communities get access to safety and services um, in the face of violence. After the Reagan administration, along with some of Reagan's austerity measures and kind of like the militarization of both the country but also our police force, and the movement of funds into law enforcement came, um, that started to become the central feature of where domestic violence services were delivered, which is the current contemporary picture of DV services, right? That like law enforcement, courts, and legal processes are the driving kind of wheels of how families are engaged with and supported, handled. So after Reagan's administration, those 5,000 was reduced to about 200, I believe, nationally. So a huge shift in funds away from grassroots community-based organizations and into the law enforcement context. Now, of course, I need to be fair. At the time, of course, these were very celebrated. Like this is one of the first times that women in the United States could call the police and get immediate access to safety, right? This was like something that was not available before. Now, mind you, respectfully, this is a celebration for white feminists, right? Because we still have communities that are very afraid of policing that is occurring in their communities. Um, but still, it's important to acknowledge that these things in the story that I'm telling them sometimes get understood as like negatives, but the process, it's important to understand how complex and nuanced these movements are. It's not as simple as my narrative is making it out to be. And so, yeah, we want restraining orders to support families. We want law enforcement to support families, especially we all know how incredibly dangerous domestic violence calls are. The United States is an indiscriminately armed country. We need law enforcement support. But the centrality here is what I'm trying to make visible. And the Duluth model, of course, was a set of research that developed all kind of the power control wheel and the relational dynamics that we talk about based off a fairly small sample size in Duluth, Minnesota, that became universalized across the nation and actually internationally as well. So we talk about the power control wheel and the relationship cycles. It's a dominant feature of DV services and has been for about 40 or 50 years. And again, these features, it was research on white Christian women in Duluth, Minnesota. Again, not like nothing wrong with that community, but that the experiences of these communities and the understandings were universalized and standardized across all communities. So whether you're a Spanish speaker in San Diego, um, or a Dominican person in Washington, D.C., you're going to encounter the same ideology. So 50 years later, 40 years later, of kind of doing the same stuff, putting a lot of money into continuing to put money into law enforcement and criminal systems. Therapists and psychologists of course, come alongside all this and bring forward psychological descriptions of criminality, categorical descriptions of who people are and how they behave. Um, kind of works alongside the court systems in crafting and constructing, well, using diagnostic models alongside um, predictors of criminality, if I could say that. And what you start to see is that the family therapy world, especially around the 80s, starts to get edged out pretty hard. Because the family therapy world, in some ways, kind of comes into clash sometimes with the domestic violence standard, like mainstream services, because family therapists tend to look at problems as relational and within family systems. And the history of domestic violence services, as shaped by second wave feminists, had a lot to, there was a lot of contention with that because let me take both sides of the argument. Family therapists might say, hey, like domestic violence is a relational dynamic. Shouldn't we look at the relational context to support families in making sense of what happened and access safety? And now I'm a second wave feminist talking back to a family therapist saying, well, isn't it also true that in that process, especially when you have poorly trained or let's say like male therapists or psychologists who come in and say, yeah, it's a family system, doesn't it start to blame the victim and unduly put pressure on the victim to kind of take responsibility for their part in the violence? It's a compelling argument. And it's kind of the argument that effectively won, if I could say that in the moment. Um, but since then, a lot of research has been done, and I'm going to share some of this literature review stuff with you that showed, well, I'll just go through it with you. So some of the contemporary research that we've had since then, that one of the things that emerged is that in the US, couples counseling for any court-ordered offenders is not permitted until after gendered work, meaning once the clients complete their classes or their groups, 52-week, 26-week survivors groups, parenting class, all that stuff, couples counseling is not allowed. This is based off of a history or around liability, right? Like we don't want people to get injured and we want to be liable for what might come from that. I'm also mentioning gendered work too, because I think it was, I see Gina almost here, and I think she was in that conversation, but it was like within the last 10 years, I think, and Gina, correct me if I'm wrong, that we developed an all gender non-binary group that the center now runs. So it's very recently that we've even considered how to approach working with people outside of a gendered context, right? So again, now when we start to look at male survivors and female perpetrators, we get very confused, right? Or not confused, but the system does isn't sure how to respond or how to like move those people through particular classes because they don't really exist. And I remember when I was on a DVRT, one of the things that stood out the most prominently to me was my work with the male survivors who we get calls out to because I really had no services for them. I had a whole list of all the wonderful services all of you all offer here in San Diego, which I'm so proud of our San Diego domestic violence community, honestly. I think we do some cutting edge stuff. I think that our services field is amazing. I've met some of the most amazing people in the field. And I think given our location here on the border requires us to be on the margins of the work and kind of be creative. But that said, the majority of the services tend to be privileged for female survivors and male offenders. And so when we would encounter male survivors, it was like, uh, there's a homeless shelter downtown. There's this shelter for men in Antelope Valley, which is, I think, several hours away. Point being. So alongside that, that there has not been great research indicating the success of gender-specific group treatment. Some studies indicate that it's about a 15% success rate, meaning no recidivism, and that like the accountability features have been met. Um, and that Stith et al., particularly a Kansas State researcher that I really like, identified that couples intervention or domestic violence was directly addressed. So again, like the therapist is attending to the features of DV and directly addressed them, did not actually decrease physical safety for the women. So this is like speaking to those second wave feminists in that argument I invented, where they're saying poorly trained, and that's true. Poorly trained therapists can do a lot of harm, a lot of harm. And people have a right to be suspicious, honestly. Um, Further, research indicates that developing practices and techniques in the context of the relationship um, tends to have a bit more impact because it's contextualized versus like sometimes what happens is we teach men coping strategies or timeout strategies. And then we are kind of engaging with similar conversations with the survivor side on safety planning and how they can like ensure that themselves and their children are safe. And then they come back together, and some of those dynamics, the structures of the relationship are just so powerful and present that it's easy to snap back. And I think we can all relate to a snap back in various contexts of our lives. You know, you go on vacation and you're like, oh my God, this is so easy living. You know what? When I go home, I'm going to make it a point to always listen to reggae and play my guitar every day, just like I did on my vacation. And then you get home and you're like, well, I got to go to work and I got to pick up my kids. And life comes back pretty hard. And so the vision and dream of the daily reggae and playing guitar on the porch start to diminish. Okay, and so here's some more really important research. And again, if you guys have thoughts, concerns, questions, put them in the chat. I love talking with people. So really important here. A lot of research indicates that a lot of women want to maintain a relationship but want the violence to cease. And I think probably a lot of us have seen this and might not be surprised to see this statistic that about 50% of couples remain together after treatments, right? That like folks are kind of engaging with the power structures of the system, whether it's court mandates or CWS services. They kind of respond to those to get through, and then they go back together. It's very much true in our refugee immigrant communities. Because again, imagine you arrive in a place and you have no one else. Yeah, and there's this phrase in Arabic. Um, I don't speak Arabic, so I don't know it, but often we talk about it takes a woman 7 times to leave a relationship, and that idea is often individualized. Like we think about the psychology of the woman and what it is that's keeping her from leaving a violent relationship. But when we kind of like broaden it into like a larger socio-political picture, where do women go when they leave a violent relationship? We don't have healthcare, we don't have childcare. It's very difficult to get a job, especially if you don't have past experience to demonstrate. Nowadays, most people need two jobs to um, afford anything. And if you don't speak English, and this is the Arabic phrase, is it's better to contend with the devil in the house than the devils on the streets, right? That this fear and danger of the unknown is greater than the predictability at times of a violent abuser at home. And that also that there currently isn't really many places, if at all, for couples to talk about past violent interactions and to manage issues that remain even when this violence has ceased, right? So, like, if you're a family who is encountering violence due to various pressures and you want to engage with each other and you both want it to stop, where do you go? And this was one of my big questions. I'm like, where do people go? People often go to couples counseling, but couples counseling is its own kind of territory where we have certain, it's quote unquote contraindicated to meet with couples when there's violence. So then they go to a couples therapist, the couples therapist, oh, there's violence. I need to refer you to a DV agency. And then they go to a DV agency, and then there's, well, is there a police report? What's been going on? We have 52-week classes, right? Then we have the buffet of things that we offer, which doesn't exactly fit at times for these communities. So, okay, so any questions so far? Everyone doing okay as I'm kind of going through this? Okay. I'm going to assume that's resounding all good from my invisible audience here.
All
So I
good.
want to make a couple distinctions then around the ethics of justice and the ethics of care. And I would love to go into more detail. And if what I'm saying here in this briefness captures your attention, please check out Carol Gilligan and the ethics of care. It's a just a brilliant body of work that's been sidelined due to our patriarchal society. But effectively, the ethics of justice, which is largely how our justice system operates, assumes and creates a context where people can make ethical and moral decisions that are abstracted and from a distance, right? So that, like, for example, equality. All individuals are entitled to equal rights and opportunities. I agree with that. But again, that's just a broad statement. To really evaluate what that means, you need a context. And this is one of the critical points that Carol Gilligan brings forward in the ethics of care, is that rarely, if ever, and I think never, do people make ethical decisions removed from the people involved. They're always involved in those decisions. So she brings forward some of these tenets of the ethics of care, like how do we start to think about the decisions we make when we're working with people and we are connected to them? Yeah. Um, yeah, versus broad abstractions. And so she goes through some nice stuff, attentiveness, responsibility, competence, relational and contextual understandings. Again, I'm not going to get really into deep stuff of it, but it's worth considering because for me it was a really useful way to shift my frame of thinking from the ethics of justice, which is the primarily pillar, like the philosophical pillar in which domestic violence trainings occur through, to the ethics of care. How do we care for the people and the families that we are trying to support? And what does that look like? Yeah. So just an invitation as you're going through your work this week and whenever, what does it mean to shift from justice to care? And again, care now we're talking about all members of the family, even the people that have caused harm. Yeah. Okay, so let me contextualize my research. So these are all the questions that I'm holding. I'm being confronted with these situations that don't fit cleanly into what I was trained to think about through the kind of the mainstream domestic violence understandings. And so then I have this question. Basically, like, how do couples counselors make decisions when they're confronted with couples in violence? And so the research question is framed a little bit more academically here. What are the effects of domestic violence epistemology on couples counselors? And epistemology is the study of knowledge. In other words, like how do we know what we know? So when I say domestic violence epistemology, It's all the shared assumptions that we all have when we think about domestic violence, shaped by the Duluth model, shaped by the crime control model, shaped by the relationships dynamics cycle, the cycle of violence. There we go. That's the word I've been hunting for this whole time. By the cycle of violence. These are all things that I imagine if I was to talk to anyone in this room and I said, what are these things? You would all know it, right? And this is given to us through training, through exposure. So this is epistemology, a body of knowledge, in other words. So how does DV epistemology affect couples counselors? And then how does it affect their decisions? I'm not going to get into my method because that's not the space for it as much as I really want to. But effectively, yeah, I wanted to know how this happens. I had the opportunity. This was a qualitative study. I was able to interview folks from California. I wanted to like get a sense of California MF marriage and family therapists, in particular because state laws vary, and it was just much easier to like just think of what's happening in our particular state and our like legal systems. I think some of the key discoveries that I made. Um, I'm doing present, just as a quick aside, I'm presenting more thoroughly on this research at the Institute of Violence and Trauma and some of the upcoming conferences related to domestic violence. So if anyone wants to like see or read more of this, you can also find my doctoral dissertation online that goes through this in more depth than anyone ever probably wants to know about. So if you want that stuff, you can email me and I'll happily send it to you. So these are some of my key discoveries and how people are thinking, how people are talking, and how people are making some assumptions. First, the use of the acronym that people used would indicate the political backdrop that shaped their thinking. So, for example, folks that would say DV, domestic violence, tended to be a part of the broader domestic violence field, right? Like the service field. I think like the majority of us in this room are. We would talk about the DV field, DV services, right? So DV tended to talk about like the marketplace of ideas, I'm sorry, of services that are like dominantly provided to communities. IPV was most often used by family therapists and couples counselors and people who are doing systems relational work. IPV stands for interpersonal violence. So now the use of that acronym kind of centers the ways that things happen within a relationship, IPV. And then GBV, gender-based violence, was most dominantly used by folks who were like really on the primarily and how do I say this? Most dominantly and primarily on the survivor side of the work, like rape crisis centers, for example, where they're really working with victims of violence to support them in making sense of what happened. And often these trainings, rightfully, honestly, would go through a heavy feminist kind of analysis. So they would use the language of GBV, gender-based violence, to make visible this stuff disproportionately affects women. So the other things that, well, okay, if it's safe to say, and if you disagree, let me know. I don't know anyone in this field that has come in to make a whole bunch of money. I don't know anyone that's come into the DV services field to be rich. Um, and so people often come in to be helpers, to be activists, to kind of like, um, right or wrong that they have seen in our society or from their own life. Um, and that's kind of the energy that it would come into it. A lot of activist energy in the DV field, rightfully so. Domestic violence is a political thing. And when I say political, I don't mean like Democrat, Republican politics. I mean power. Like we're talking about power, that's what politics means, power. And so um, this was a tense relationship where people would come in as activists and helpers, and like their heart was, I'm going to help the person in front of me. And very often would be met with a different ideological position, a contradiction that would say, well, but what about your license? What about the legal parameters? You can't help that person that particular way because of liability. And so people were caught in this tension of, I really want to help people, to, I really want to protect myself legally. I want to preserve my license that I've worked so hard for. And this was a very tense marriage. Um, Pun intended, I guess. Um, and then the legal and ethical parameters that we operate under were often really closely in relationship to fear. Like they were understood through or kind of accompanied by the emotional qualities of fear. Like I was kind of describing, like the fear of being of losing your license, or the fear of someone dying, which is honestly probably a fear, useful fear in some ways. Um, but that it was that the ethical decision-making process was promoted by fear. And I hope as you're listening to me, and if you're in some agreement with what I'm saying, that you can notice the irony in all of this and how, as we're talking about the practices of fear and power and control for our clients, how those same systems operate for us as providers. That the same tactics are often used to keep us as providers in line. As I say that too, I want to be like kind of mindful. I'm not like out here just saying like everyone should do whatever they want and should just like go for it. I do think parameters are really important. Um, think that the ways that the laws are set up make a lot of sense to me in a lot of ways. It's just a curiosity of like, is fear the best emotional position to accompany ethical decision-making processes? And I don't think so. Another big distinction that I saw or discovered from my research was that there was a huge distinction between community agencies and how people in community agencies approach the work versus private practice. So, for example, people in private practice, their relationship to this thing of their relationship of fear to their legal and ethical parameters was between them and the state of California, and what they thought the state of California and like the Behavioral Board of Sciences might do to their license. And so their scope of practice was understood more broadly within a marriage and family therapist, an MFT in California. And they would be more willing to engage with couples who were in violence because they felt like they had more flexibility. But once they like set out to do this, they had a lot less clarity on how to make assessments to make, what decisions to use. Um, what decisions to make. Yeah, like it just felt a little bit more loose, and I'll explain that in a second. Versus community agencies, their relationship of fear and their sense of their scope of practice and the legal ethical parameters that surround it were held between them and the community agency. So often the policies of the community agencies were understood as their own scope of practice. And so they would be way less willing to meet with couples in violence. But if and when they did, they had a lot more clarity on the assessments to use, the processes to engage with like safety planning and the services and systems to bring them into. So to use a bit of a sailing metaphor here, folks in private practice were willing to set out to sail quickly, but once they set sail, they were a bit lost. They were kind of like in the headwinds fairly quickly. They were at the whim of the winds. Whereas people in community agencies, they were much more reserved and restrained to set sail. But once they did, they had a very direct line on where they were headed. Again, this is not good or bad or right or wrong. Just getting into like an analysis of how domestic violence epistemology is shaping people's thinking. Yeah. What you do with what your conclusions you land with too are yours. So then, continuing forward, another big distinction that happens that was influenced for sure by the community agency private practice distinction was that the clinicians have different understandings of what conflict is, what abuse is, and what is the line between violence and nonviolence. And their definitions of those were largely shaped by personal histories and trainings. So what was interesting is folks, and consider this for yourself as you're listening, folks who had family histories and personal experiences where intimate relationships, like again, like in their family, like with their parents or something, if low-level conflicts in their family systems led to abuse or fights, those people were much less likely to engage with couples who had features of violence or conflict than people whose family systems, people would get into really heightened argumentative, conflictual states, but it wouldn't get abusive and it wouldn't get violent. Those people were much more willing to tolerate a higher level of conflict. And again, not good or bad, because either one of these scenarios would be important depending on the context. The important thing is like how do we then start to consider our own personal histories and training or and how they start to influence how our body gets escalated, how we start to engage and interpret what's happening in front of us and the decisions we make. Like, oh, this is for sure a report, like a abuse report, or you know what, let me do some more exploring around what's happening here. Another thing that just kind of stood out was that bilingual practitioners, so people who spoke more than one language, tended to have a much broader understanding of DV dynamics. It wasn't as narrow in the sense that it wasn't as prescriptive, and they would often draw from both languages. They'd say, well, in English, this is kind of how we talk about this and how people make sense of the relationships like this. But in Spanish, actually, this is how we would talk about it, and this is how people would respond if this was happening. And so then they were less kind of beholden to the US American Duluth model versions of things. Again, not good or bad, just saying. Um, and this is maybe I'll relate to this. I'd love to know if you do or don't. But that the service field at various moments simultaneously says, yes, engage with families in DV, we need to help them, and no, that's unsafe, we need separation. And there was this constant push and pull in any moment about what the right step forward was. So this is like a really uh, my best attempt at a quick general thing. Any questions or thoughts so far, or like disagreements or agreements, points of convergence or divergence at this juncture? We keep going then. All right. So from this research, I um, I kind of concluded my research in a model of practice. Basically, a highly structured model of practice on how to engage with families. Thank you for those of you that are speaking. Um, to do the work with couples in the violence and high conflict. Because again, I think, again, I'm a family therapist, so of course, this is my position. But I do think that couples counselors and family therapists can play a preventative role so that when there's families who are in these tensions and don't want the legal systems or law enforcement systems involved, but need a place to kind of figure this stuff out, that family therapists could be a space where that could happen. That could happen. So I developed what's called the down and forward approach, and I'm going to talk about what that is. And this never happens, but amazingly, 3 months after I wrote this and concluded this research and this model, we applied for and received a federal grant called REHMA, Refugee Empowerment Minor and Healing for Minors and Adults, to use evidence-informed practices to deliver free couples counseling and family therapy to families who are in um, violence and high levels of conflict. And I think, dare I say, it might be one of the only programs in the United States that does this. But my hope is, and part of the reason I was so excited and thankful to SCDVC for inviting me is that like maybe a thought, like planting a seed or encouragement, like could your agency perhaps offer these services, couples counseling or family therapy services? Now, again, to do the work requires a lot of training and very specific training. I am not up here saying people should do couples counseling when there's violence. Absolutely not my position. Couples counseling is and can be very dangerous when there's violence. But I do think that there's approaches that could be considered. So Rehma is a program that we offer at domestic violence. It's Arabic for mercy. The word in Farsi is rah, which means mercy. Um, And it's a preventative effort, like I said, and it's kind of grounded in the theoretical and philosophical approaches that I have described so far. It's set up to serve, like these are families that would qualify for it, are like parents and children and youth who are immigrants or refugees. I say primarily Middle Eastern. I set it up for refugees. I say primarily Middle Eastern because that's who License to Freedom is set up to engage with. But my hope is that it has applicability across other refugee and immigrant communities. Like you know, Americans here in the United States. And the criteria to qualify is that there cannot be any legal constraints. You can't be enrolled in DVIP, there can't be restraining orders or criminal protective orders. And that while we're talking about family therapy or couples counseling, it isn't to assume that people need to come back together. People need to kind of like get back into a relationship with each other and move forward. It's about safety and accountability. And sometimes that means people divorce or move apart. And so again, like um, we're kind of tracking the family very closely and what's best for them, but through the lens of safety and accountability. There's a question here. What about limits set by funding sources, OVW, to allow work with perpetrator? Yeah, that's a really good question. So, oh, such a good question. So I want to like take respond to this question in two ways. One, to directly respond to a question. Um, the criteria to qualify like cannot be engaged in legal constraints, kind of attend to those limits set by funding sources. Um, because a lot of them do kind of use legal criteria as the legal context as the criteria for being able to access services, if that makes sense. But this question that you're asking about what the funding sources, back to what I was talking about with, well, okay, sorry. I'm excited by the question. I'm excited to respond. When we think about how is it that the last 50 years of DV services, we've done the same things, more or less. And we continue to rely on the same systems. And I'm not sure that I'm not familiar with, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not familiar with any research or statistics that indicate that DV has gotten better or like less as a societal problem. And I think we can all relate to that. Culturally, people don't talk about domestic violence until something happens in the news with a celebrity or something. One sec. Sorry, my dog is licking, and it's like a very annoying sound. Um, where was I? Yeah, so in that question of like how has things been so stagnant, the answer goes back to these funding sources. Yeah, that like funding sources tend to have a pretty powerful influence on what is acceptable and okay practices and what is not. So for example, when we look at cognitive behavioral therapy, as just like an aside, CBT. CBT is one of the biggest evidence-based treatments that therapists use. Is it the best? I don't know, but it's used the most dominantly and gets the most funding because it's the most evidence-based, and largely because CBT fits really nicely into the insurance model of service delivery. It's diagnosable, it's 8 to 12 sessions, it's very easily billable. Insurance doesn't want to pay for you to go to therapy for a year or two to talk about your challenges with your mother, right? Like it wants you to be in and out quickly, and they want to know what you're doing along the way. So then insurance companies, which are huge contributors to research, put a lot of money into CBT studies. And so then you just kind of see, um, I can't think of a good metaphor, but like you keep circling the same area, and it's called evidence-based, if that makes sense. Yeah, so funding and research are really closely tied. And then funding is really directly connected to broader political activities. So thank you for your question. Appreciate it. And if I didn't answer it, let me know. I'll circle back to it. Um, and if in folks with limited financial resources, of course, because couples counseling is super expensive, and if anyone wants to get couples counseling, you know it's so expensive. Um, and so we're trying to support folks who would not access couples counseling otherwise. Um, So when folks make contact with our team, like any family that comes into this program will encounter this particular team. You'll have 1 to 2 family therapists who work alongside each other. You have a case manager slash interpreter. The interpreter and the case manager are one and the same because the idea is that the person who's in the room listening, and interpreters really should be considered more than just language translators. They're brokering culture. Like there's a lot of emotional, affective lines of conversation influence that the interpreters often kind of translate to you. That's beyond just words. And so the interpreter is listening closely to what's happening and can respond to the needs of the family. So here's a bit of a research supported hot take. And I want to be careful. The reason I want to be careful is I want to be like mindful that here I am, a male therapist speaking to a community of really hard workers, and that violence against domestic violence does disproportionately affect women. And there is a long legacy and history of male providers and patriarchal systems and institutions like psychology, like law enforcement and court systems that tend to privilege a patriarchal approach that contribute to more harm to women, right? So I want to just kind of acknowledge that I'm part of a broader political system and process. I want to be humble to that. That said, while a lot of the original 20th century second wave feminist ideas center gender as a primary contributor to violence, contemporary research, and this includes I'm just going to say fourth wave feminists, third and fourth wave feminists, and contemporary research all agree that gender isn't the primary influencer of violence. So follow me here. And this is this is kind of like across a lot of research that one of the biggest predictors of violence in families is overwhelming stress, often at the hands of economic and financial pressures. So basically that as you consider the pressures of family encounters, creates like a substrate of energy that then is expressed through the power hierarchies of the family. So if we're talking about a patriarchal family, we have a male head of household, uh, female wife, and children, and you have that kind of that hierarchy based on this patriarchal structure, that then the stress of the family gets expressed downwards through the hierarchy, if that makes sense. And so in a lot of ways, yeah, the second wave feminists weren't wrong. Like in our societies in the United States, and Middle Eastern societies were patriarchal societies. And so no one was wrong in noticing, oh my God, like women are constantly subjected to male violence. Um, and it's really quite a common feature when we look at these incidents. Yeah. But again, the substrate is this financial stuff. So the intention of the case manager is that they are equipped with financial resources to pay off some of the bills and reduce the financial burdens of the family so that they can focus on the relational dynamics. This is a 12-week program, 3 months. That's not very long, honestly. However, it is critical to kind of consider that even for a short period of time, if we can relieve a little pressure, it might allow people to look at each other through a different lens or kind of like get the space to think about the relational dynamics and what they're hoping for in the future. Um, and then we have, of course, program coordinator who's supporting administratively. Every week, anyone working with these families is going through supervision and talking about the case. And this is a feature of accountability for the provider. Like I said, we don't want the provider to be completely at the whim of their own personal histories and experiences. We want them to be talking through their thinking. And then we have an expressive arts therapist who comes in partway to create a project that's outside of talk therapy and problem saturated conversations, to create a project with the family that results in a production, like a creation that they get to all enjoy together. So the model is called the down and forward approach, and it has several phases that it goes through. Again, it's highly structured because in so many ways, I believe that there's safety in structure. So let's say one of you is thinking about a family that you think would be a good fit for this program, and you email me, you're like, Navid, I have a family, can you enroll them? My response would be, yes, we'll absolutely do a consultation. That is the first step. In the consultation meeting, I meet with both partners and I'm asking myself, is it appropriate to engage in conjoint therapy with this family? And I'm engaging in a number of informal assessments. Um, Importantly, I'm not opening up problem spores very much. I'm not opening up the can of worms in this conversation. I just want to hear just enough about what's going on to um, get a sense of the story. But some of the things I'm wondering, I'm kind of assessing for are, do both partners take a stance against violence? What is their each partner's commitment to therapy? Right? Because I use a metaphor of therapy like, when you go to the gym and you lift weights once and then you go home and then you never go back to the gym and then you're sore for like 4 days and basically you're sore for no reason because the soreness is only valuable if you keep going and it contributes to more muscle mass. And I think therapy is similar. Like once or twice tends to just hurt for no reason. Um, so I kind of invite the families to give it three tries. And if at the end of three you're like, it's not working with this person or just other things, then we'll have a different conversation. Is fear present? Is one person afraid to talk in the presence of the other person? And are their stories congruent, right? Like, are big features left out of one story or the other? Like, for example, one person's like, yeah, I got home and I was like making dinner and then they got really mad at me. And so then I just like was very frustrated. And the other person says, yeah, I got home and they were making dinner and we got into a fight and then they punched me in the face. And the other person left out that piece. That's not a good sign or not, they might not be a good fit for this process because we need a particular, it doesn't need to be 100% agreement. No one ever has the same story, but we need a general interest in some base level of accountability. And then I'm interested in the directionality of the violence. Is it bidirectional? Is it going both ways? This is very important criteria. What's the severity, right? Like if there's strangulation happening, we're not talking about couples counseling. We're talking probably about the services that a lot of us are involved in. And I don't need to tell this community why strangulation is not a good fit for couples counseling. And also, like, what's the context of the violence? Is this like an abusive pattern that has existed for over like a long time and one person's committed to the power control process? Or are we looking at situational context in which violence has emerged? And then the supervisor reviews and signs off before beginning. And then we, of course, provide referrals to various programs as needed. So at License Free, and we have housing navigators, like all those programs that I mentioned. It's very convenient that we have in-house for this process. So if they pass the consultation or if they kind of fit the criteria and we go through the consultation, then we begin the A section. And I kind of used a jazz standards metaphor to organize this, where like in jazz standards, you have the A section, which is kind of like um, kind of a harmonizing, a collecting of like the themes. And then the B section is where one person solos and like kind of the music is kind of like flowing in more of an improv type state. And then if whenever needed, the band leader, which would be the therapist in this, would call back to the A section as needed. So if things don't go well in the B section, which is a conjoint therapy part, we go back to individual. So in the A section, we're preparing for conjoint therapy. It's 6 individual sessions, typically, and we assess for safety. We continue the assessments for safety, congruence, presence of fear, and the level of marital discord. We are learning and talking about safety. We're developing safety plans. We're identifying community members that are committed to this family to move towards peace and safety. We talk about accountability and equality, what each person's expectations of those things are and what they look like and what they need to see. Intergenerational factors, impact of immigration, and of course, war and other like things that kind of people are bringing with them from their home countries. Their concerns and hesitations about couples counseling, and what are the existing power structures in the family? Like when violence occurs, how does it move through? And then we use a couple formal assessments, like the danger assessment, of course, and the conflict tactics scale. But because of the multilinguality of the work, the informal assessments take priority typically. So we go through these 6 sessions, and then we go into the B section, which is the conjoint therapy. The therapist takes on an active, non-neutral stance because the therapist has to make a stand against violence and has to kind of be involved to interrupt some of the features that may have been leading to the trouble and the violence. Yeah. We're encouraging reflexivity for everyone in the room, therapists included, but definitely for the clients where they're thinking about how is my body, my physiology being affected, right? Like people's bodies are really closely affected. Like when you walk into a room and you feel the energy of a room, right? We can feel people's physiology. Um, what are like the linguistic pieces? Like what is the language that they're using towards each other and how does it shape the reality of their worlds and what they think is possible? And then how do they make sense of their contribution to any particular relational dynamic? We're working with power and trying to figure part of some of the questions that I hold to like kind of analyze and wonder about power in a relationship is which partner is able to influence the other, who feels entitled to express their needs or have them fulfilled, and who accommodates or organizes around the other, who responds to care. So these are some of the ways that we're talking about and making sense of how power moves to the family. Because again, in this position, in this conversation, I'm not saying power is bad. Power is a part of any human relationship. It's kind of these out of control dynamics in which then violence emerges that we're really concerned about, and staying really close to their experience, keeping a close eye on safety and facilitating that throughout. And like I've said, kind of this mutual attunement, we're turned in towards each other, we're tuned to each other, and taking responsibility for our relational part. In the B section, the expressive arts facilitator also then meets with the family and begins their art project along the way. Um, the therapist meets with the expressive arts facilitator to like kind of support, like kind of stay in coordination with them. And this is where really the children get involved through the expressive art stuff. And the practices of safety are tracked weekly. Ask every week for a scaling question around um, safety. And after we do a 6 month follow-up, we do individual and couples check-ins. To see how things are going for the family. And I encourage all our therapists to write a letter or a poem to the family, kind of indicating to them how they understood their work, the hopes they have for them, things that stood out to them and resonated to them from their own lives, yeah, the meaningfulness of the relationship ultimately. So I spoke at you for an hour and a half ish, and I'm like really grateful to all of you for your presence and interest in this. Um, if you have questions, if you have referrals, anything, you can email me. My email's up there, navid@licensefreedom.org. I'll also put it in the chat. But yeah, at this point, I'll kind of pause and see if there's questions, and thank you. So here's a question. What have been the 6 month follow-ups when compared with DV counseling? Could you clarify the question? Sorry. I'm not understanding the
So I
one.
think the question is like when compared with what is usual with sick with DV counseling, how does the conjoined, that's how I was saying it. Like how what is the difference between being in a this conjoined therapy with both parties and the family compared to how we do therapy in the world of DV, where it's one person doing the work and the other person doing the work separately, and they don't get to do the couples therapy until the year is over or the courts processes are completed.
That's a really good question. Thanks for the clarification. Um, my first and honest response is we're still collecting data, and I don't have the data to make that comparison.
Mhm.
Um, However, I'm also not thinking of this as a replacement to the service model that you described, where we have individualized treatment. My hope is that the field is able to develop a ability to have a more nuanced assessments and kind of a more diverse uh, set of offerings for families so that we're not kind of lumping all families into our current service field model, which is set up for extreme levels of kind of like intimate partner terrorism and the power control wheel, right? Like this would never replace your safe place or one safe place, for example. Those are services like intentionally set up for families that need critical care in a particular way. I'm hoping that this becomes more of an add-on to existing models that we use, if that makes sense.
Yes, this has been a wonderful presentation. We have a lot of Amazing. Thank you. 100%. Totally connect with the power struggle that you described earlier. Resonating with a lot of what you're discussing. So a lot of alignment with your thoughts and your ideas, Navid.
Thanks. I'm grateful for that.
Mm, yeah,
Yeah, thank you for hosting me. I appreciate it.
yeah. I think
Yeah, and like I said, like I don't hold any answers here. These are all questions really and curiosities I'm exploring. Um, so yeah, so if folks are again like are finding points of connection or convergence, like I'd love to hear it, and I'm always open to conversation. So thanks again for the
yes. Thank you very
invitation.
much. No, we loved having you here. Um, I
And
am
Navid, I just want to say what I really appreciate. I mean, thank you for again, thank you. But what I really value and admire about you, Navid, is that your ability to contextualize and critically think um, about this issue. You know, I love your stories too about the language of what the F word means. You know, that it sounds like it's more of the emotionality and the tone than the
Hmm.
actual literal um semantic, but yeah, I mean it's a tiny minor nuance that just doesn't get pulled to the forefront of our um like the pragmatic of the impact. And then the impact that it has is
Hmm.
detrimental. So and with, first responders, sure they have their own trauma histories, if they're in the military, it's anyways, I just like the um you know, contextualization and critical thinking that you have about this. So I admire that. And thank you. Because we need more of that. And the I agree, yeah, power isn't bad. It's abuse of power. Power is there. There is no escape. There's hierarchy. There's,
Right.
sure. And I really like that you just said it straightly. And I 100% agree. So
Thanks for your generous reflections, Dr. B. And yeah, I always like the example I use is like, I think a lot of us have had really, hopefully, a good coach at some point in our lives. And it's often like a good example of a positive power dynamic where someone has like a useful influence in our lives. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I talk about it with all the therapists. Like there is no matter what, there is no meet 'em at equal plane, no.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Well, thank you.
wonderful. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Navid, for your time and such a wonderful conversation. Certainly, it's gonna, I'm sure, generate a lot of thoughts and questions and maybe ideas of, what could be different approaches to support families.